ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Welcome to Earshot. I'm your host, Takumbudzi. The Other Me is the name of our current season, featuring people framing their stories in a new light. Today, painter and visual artist Leon Fernandez introduces us to his friend Max, a trans man whose transitioning story is not as simple as flipping from one side to another, like, when you turn a vinyl record over.
There's just more freedom. A lot of masculinity and what's expected of men is super rigid and really suffocating.
Max was assigned female at birth and transitioned to male when he was 17 years old. He has unique and extraordinary insights from seeing the world first as women experience it, and then now as a man. And that's what his friend Leon was curious to learn more about. And just a word of warning, there's some strong language coming up.
Stronger together, I guess, but I feel like I wonder.
Max has been a friend of mine for a few years. We were initially colleagues, then we worked on a podcast together about mental health. Once, he rang me out of the blue and asked if he could hang out in my art studio. He told me he wanted to explore creativity.
Yeah, could have been that.
We ended up spending many studio sessions together and talked about a whole heap of stuff, mostly about the politics of psychiatry, madness and activism. Curiously, we never spoke about his gender. Except for this one time, a few years ago, when he told me something really surprising about how men and women behave differently in public toilets. More on that later. But it turns out there are lots of other differences too.
Probably the biggest thing that's impacted me the most is warmth from people.
What?
Warmth.
People are warmer to you?
No.
Oh.
Much colder. In essence, in every space you're in, you're a threat. The first moment where this went off for me after I transitioned, I was walking late at night, and something that women get taught when they're growing up is at night, if you're alone, to huddle around other women. So you kind of can cluster or stay closer together, like power in numbers vibes. So I was walking late at night, and there was a woman in front of me, and she looked over her shoulder and looked very fearful. And then I looked over my shoulder and I couldn't see anything. And I was like, fuck. I was freaking out because I couldn't see it. And then she looked again, and then I looked again, and then it clicked that it was me for the first time, that someone had looked and she was scared of me.
So for the first time in your life, you were the perceived potential perpetrator?
Yeah. It was kind of mind-blowing at the time, but it almost felt like it confirmed part of my transition. In a sense, there was an element of wow, this is where I've gotten to, because a lot of this is visual and subconscious. There's nothing I've said. It's just on looking at me alone. But I felt really bad that she now would be in fear because of me just being near her.
Max looks like the kind of guy you might meet at a barbecue in the country. He's got a bit of a 5 o'clock shadow and a teddy bear kind of energy. Even though he's young, he's kind of like the uncle you can always rely on.
Sometimes when I'm meeting new people, even I'm a bit better at it now, but it's like in my head I'm trying to manually remember that I'm a man in this space and that I have to behave differently. A big part of it is personal space, like the proximity you can stand to someone is very weird. As a woman, you can stand much closer, but if I'm at the pub with a guy I've literally just met and I'm standing incredibly close to him, it's very strange. Men get very what the fuck are you doing? And I was like, oh, fucking hell, there's all these fucking rules with you lot. But it's you've got to be distant and pretty much no affection unless you're really comfortable with a man, which is not common with women. You can build closeness so much quicker, and what is considered very normal affection in women relationships is seen as either gay or whatever, creepy for men. I remember going into my mum's room when I was like somewhere like quite young. And I remember like waking my mum up in the middle of the night and being like, I think I'm gay. She was like, no, you're not. Go back to bed. And then I went, okay. I went back to bed.
Oh my God, if only my coming out story was that easy.
It didn't work that time. I thought it, and then Mum was like, no. But then I was like, oh, okay. I remember I used to get made fun of a lot that I was like butch or not feminine, or like I was called a lesbian when I was like 11 for the first time. So I didn't even have a concept of that. But I remember distinctly a couple of girls in my year came up to me and like, you know when young kids like that are asking you a question and you can tell in the tone and the delivery that they're bullying you. They were like, do you want a sex change? As clearly as that.
Whoa.
I remember at the time going, no, and internally I remember going, And then, when I was 16, I was at a house party and there was someone there who was like very cool looking and they were very like masculine presenting. And then they were talking about like being a trans man. And I was like, what the fuck is that? I was like, what? And then, you know those moments where something clicks and you have that, oh my God, that's me moment. And you kind of like, oh shit. He was telling me and I was like, oh no. Initially I was like, oh my God. Like I was like, that is what it is. And then I just felt utter despair. And I remember this guy who was, I think, being really supportive and was talking about it very normally. But for me, I was like you might have experienced it like when you're sort of even like opening yourself up to being gay and you almost feel like scared of it. And you're like, oh, stop. Like, I don't want to. It was kind of like that. And he was quite comfortable with it and quite educated even back then. And he was kind of talking about like name change stuff and like binders.
Binders are what some trans men use to flatten their chests.
And I just like retreated back into myself because the thought of that, the amount of life admin alone, I was like, no way.
Keep me a lesbian.
Seriously. I wish I could have survived as a lesbian, personally. But I think for me, the alignment that happened within like my soul when I started transitioning was like massive magnets clicking together. Like I felt it. It was very powerful. It makes me a bit teary now thinking about it because it was so emotional.
Max started his transitioning at the age of 17. It was a rigorous process that needed to be navigated with the help of a really skilled social worker. It required stacks of psychological screening, historical evidence of Max's gender dysphoria. His parents had to be interviewed too to verify Max's experience. Then, one psychologist, 2 GPs and 2 psychiatrists had to sign off before Max could start medically transitioning.
It felt like tectonic plates moving and like aligning, and there was a wholeness that I felt within me even though my external world separated a lot. It was kind of like having to choose between, do I live like this, really disconnected and disjointed and try my luck with it? Or do I accept that I might lose everything to live as myself and just figure it out?
I've known Max for 5 years, but he's been Max for a decade. And he's had a few girlfriends in that time. Literally, just before lockdown, he had his first date with a woman called Mags. They became bubble buddies and got really close because they were only seeing each other. And earlier this year, they got married.
People just love him so much. You know, he's extremely charismatic and people, you know, love him and really, they warm to him quite quickly. It's like we always joke, like, because almost every interview he's gone for, he's got the job. He'll be nervous before the interview and I'll be like rolling my eyes because I'll be like, baby, you'll literally get the job.
What's the difference between Max and your previous boyfriends?
It's a funny question. I think the main difference that I noticed in the beginning, he has a level of patience and understanding that I relate to more. He's much more aware of his male privilege now after transitioning, and I think that doesn't make him immune to it. Like, he definitely still has the privilege and he, it still exists, but he's definitely able to check it.
I've always casually considered myself a feminist, but I've never really thought about all the free passes and benefits that come with being a man.
Being a man, people don't critique or challenge things I say nearly as much. I don't know how to specifically sum it up, but before transition, any opinion, any fact, any evidence-based thing you would say as a woman, people are like, that can't be right. No. And they will like fight you on it all the time. But being a man, you can say as stupid shit as you want and people just don't like, people are more likely to believe that you know what you're saying, which is hilarious to me.
And it's so funny thinking of him with male privilege because there are so many parts of his life that he doesn't have those privileges.
Like Mags told me about Max's reluctance to take his shirt off publicly because it reveals his top surgery. He's experienced being gawked at by strangers. But Mags's friends were fine that she was with a trans man. And when her mum figured out what it meant, she was okay about it too.
I remember would have been very, very early on, and Mum was just having a conversation with me about it was in the realm of probably fertility or ensuring that I didn't get pregnant. I think Mum alluded to something like, oh, just make sure you're being safe or something like that. And I just said, oh, that won't be an issue. And she was like, why? And I said, oh, Max is actually transgender.
Which is when Mags launched that.
Yeah.
In that moment, it had not been launched prior to that.
She said, she goes, oh, okay, right. And I could just see the cogs were turning. She's obviously trying to she's overthinking what do I say?
She had met me at that point.
Yeah, no, she had.
Yeah.
I think she'd met you in passing or something at that point. And then, we were just talking about fertility and how all that works. And later down the track, she said, well, if you ever needed eggs or anything, you could always use mine.
It's a problem, doll. Too many.
I said, no, we've got enough of them. And she looked at me and she was like, oh, God, that's right. Yeah, sorry. Yep.
I thought it was really beautiful because it was obvious that she probably would have had hardly any literacy or even exposure to trans people. And even for her to be just kind of workshopping it in a way that wasn't transphobic, it was biologically, what do you guys need?
Yeah.
Which is quite beautiful, actually.
Mags really appreciates it when she gets home at the end of the day and has a whinge. Max knows exactly where she's coming from. And, just a heads up, we talk about cis or cisgender, which means a person that identifies with the gender that they were assigned at birth, which is most of us.
Just being able to talk about the experience as a woman, patriarchy, misogyny, fat phobia, transphobia, homophobia, all of those gorgeous things, he just gets. And I don't even really have to finish my sentence and he knows what I'm talking about. He understands the intersection, basically, of it.
But I imagine he'd have a unique insight that cis men would never, ever have access to.
Yeah, absolutely. They just don't. And I think, I can see myself sitting there and explaining it to them. And it's not the fault of theirs. They just don't get it because it's not their experience.
Maddie and Adam are some of Max's oldest friends. They knew him before and during transitioning.
They are probably my longest standing friends. I love them so much. Maddie and Adam were the first people in my life that I felt genuine loyalty.
Max described you both as the unsung heroes of his life. How do you feel when I say that?
I mean, I have goosebumps, but I think for us, it's just being who we are regardless of who it's to. I think the impact that we specifically had on Max's life was just being constant.
Essentially, I'm an only child. I do have half siblings, and I would consider them my full siblings regardless, but I think I've always wanted a little brother, and I saw that in Max. I've not really ever thought about it, but I've always wanted the best for him.
Max, Mags and I went on a road trip from Sydney up to the Central Coast to meet up with Maddie and Adam. We got into a juicy conversation. The first thing I wanted to talk about was that thing that Max said about how men and women behave differently in public toilets. Adam, you're in a pub with mates. You both go to the bathroom together. Do you talk?
It depends if you're pissed enough, but mostly no. If it's when you first go in, then probably not, but after 10 drinks later, definitely talking.
I remember when I first went into the men's bathroom, I was fucking freaking out. I was like, I thought everyone was just I thought everyone wasn't talking because of me. Because I was like, why is no one talking in here? I was like, this is so weird. It's so awkward and tense, and I thought it was me.
I think it's just the whole strong silent thing. If you want to say something wrong in the most vulnerable place, because outside you with your mates or whatever, you feel quite, I don't know, strong, I guess. But when you're in there, you don't want to seem weak in there. There's probably not a weaker position that you could be in.
Purely because you're weeing.
Well, I'm not going to fight someone while I'm pissing, am I?
So it's about that.
I guess so.
I
don't really think about it.
Okay.
Can I ask you, is there a difference?
There is definitely a difference. Women only talk in the bathrooms, I feel.
It's you step into a feminist support group. And there are people crying, but then there are people supporting people crying, and the solidarity and stuff is incredible. You'd be in there for fucking 2 hours and be having the time of your life.
When I heard this, I was a bit envious. The conversation then got into shaking hands, and Max and I both worked out we didn't know the unspoken rules.
I'd always struggled with shaking hands because once you start shaking hands as a man, people expect, I didn't know that you had to make eye contact and that you've got to really grip it, because guys were shaking my hand and they were grabbing it and I was like, what the fuck? What are you doing?
Yeah.
Because they'd been shaking my hand as a woman, which is not them fucking, the amount of grip that's appropriate, which I still haven't found that out.
But Adam seems to be handshake literate.
I feel you can see what their personality is. You feel the timid side to them when not confident in that's confidence. That's your, hey mate, how you going? Solid connection. I don't feel I would relate with that person until obviously you get to know them a bit more. But if you're judging person straight up on appearance and how they hold themselves, you'd say that they're a weaker person.
And where do we learn that?
I think it's literally just trial and error. You shake an older man's hand and they squeeze the shit out of your hand. So you're next time I'm going to fucking squeeze the shit out of your hand.
There's always this question about nature and nurture, Mars and Venus, testosterone, estrogen. I reckon Max is sort of an authority about all of this because he's lived with and without testosterone.
People also act like there is such biological and cognitive differences between men and women, chemically. And I personally believe a lot of it is social. The differences are ones that we construct. Things like where you were raised, how you were raised, cultural background, class, all those things would impact significantly more than just testosterone. Hormones and the biology, to me, seem like the fine print. Our world is so structured by bias and gender that it impacts every single bit of your day. As a man, for the most part, people don't expect you to do anything.
What?
They don't. Or they have an acceptance that you may not do anything. People wouldn't expect you to remember birthdays, to remember to pick up stuff, to clean things, to book appointments. They would not expect you to do that. Often men aren't expected to be organised or clean. As a woman, cleanliness and your ability to upkeep a house is given real, moral value.
This is a really big issue for a lot of couples. So I was wondering how Max and Mags divide up their housework.
Not very well.
Oh, well. We really don't. There's really no success story in that part.
We've not been able to break the binary on this one.
We talk about it often, and I have always found it really difficult.
But the difference for me in terms of other relationships with men has really been the acknowledgement of it and it being a constant conversation, something that we're constantly working on and talking about. And I do get recognition from Max. He will take time to say, hey, I noticed this week you've done a lot in the house and I noticed you've done a lot for us. So I just want to say I really appreciate it. And it's not that I'm saying thanks for doing that because that's your job. It's just thanks. I'm acknowledging that I've seen it. And that's a bit that hasn't been present prior.
Then there are those casual comments we hear so often that when you think about it are brutally misogynist and perhaps affect us all. Maybe things like being called a pussy make it so hard for us to cry or to challenge each other, and make it too easy for a man who bragged about sexual assault to become the President of the United States.
I think for a lot of men, it's like you being anything like a woman is shameful. Anything. Shame is such a big motivator in how men are kept in boxes, which is strange to me because I found how a lot of other men feel shame. A lot of the shame is being like a woman. It centers the woman as the shameful thing, which I already know is a crock of shit. So I'm okay. The amount that we tie femininity to weakness is so obvious in how people talk when they say things are girly, or if they say you're being a pussy, right? All of it is intertwined. Every weak insult that men use with each other often is connected to being a woman.
Max said something that stopped me in my tracks, and it still sits somewhere uneasily within me. It's about loneliness and connection.
I think for me, the biggest impact has been it's very difficult to connect with people that you don't know compared to what it is as a woman. And this is a big one, but I personally feel like this is something I haven't said very much, so I might be very clunky. I'm trying to get the words right. But I feel like as Max as I am now is me being my most authentic self. But in terms of meaning in my life, it would have been easier if I could have survived as a woman rather than transitioning. It's hard to explain. I don't want people to think that it's not necessarily that it's not as simple as I miss being a woman. It's more that the interpersonal flexibility that you get with people and how you connect and how you can... There's just more freedom. A lot of masculinity and what's expected of men is super rigid and really suffocating. And then when you do something out of that, it's often perceived as gay or weird. There's a creepy element that gets attached to anything that's outside the norm because I think people fear it. But for me, I feel like it's hard saying that because I've also inherited a lot of male privileges in a sense. But for me, you get the privileges, but you get the isolation.
My initial assumption was that all the differences between men and women were about men's lives being better and easier than women's. But this isolation stuff really resonated with me. You and Max look like a straight couple. How are you received in queer spaces?
That's a great question. It's we don't quite fit in, but then we're in the other spaces We don't feel like we fit in, even though we might look like we do. So, yeah.
For me, I always felt really uncomfortable in very straight dominated spaces, because I was like, I've had a very different experience to a lot of them, and also I'm kind of on edge of them finding this out about me from someone. But then in queer spaces, when you're around other gay people, there's a camaraderie and a community to it. But now looking like this, I don't get that. I was often overlooked, because it's how do you tell someone that you're trans and it be just commonly in conversation, but they're often not talking to me until they know that. So it's weird. You're seen as the straight guy in the gay club, and I'm like, oh, for fuck's sake. It doesn't work at that one or this one, and they both end up, you're just feeling empty.
Adam and Maddie made a comment that sort of sums up what could be considered as Max's superpowers, because he's lived in both worlds.
Max has seen both sides of probably this relationship with our personalities and whatever else, and he understands the female perspective and the male perspective.
Oh, he is by far your best psychologist that you don't pay for.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Well, we pay in other ways.
I think psychologists should be like Max.
I've learnt so much from Max. I wonder how many women wouldn't be beaten up and sexually assaulted by men if men had the permission to be vulnerable. I wonder how many male suicides wouldn't happen too. I feel a deep level of sadness when I think about these imaginary gender differences. Trans people can teach us a heap about being human.
There is a lot that everyone can learn from the experiences of trans people. And I think in some cultures where it's titled two-spirited, there's a lot of storytelling about how trans people, non-binary or gender diverse people historically were used as mediators in conflicts between men and women, or used as people who could bridge gaps between genders, and they had a really meaningful function within communities on being able to bridge some of that divisiveness and have a better sense of community and stuff, which I wish that we would use that more. And I think we'll potentially get there.
This story was produced on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation by Leon Fernandez, with sound engineer Simon Branthwaite and Claudia Taranto as supervising producer. The next episode of Earshot is pretty personal. It's mine, actually. I'll share the secret I held onto when I was 23 that ultimately broke my father's heart. I'm Takumbudzi, signing off until next time. Bye!
You've been listening to an ABC podcast. Discover more great ABC podcasts, live radio and exclusives on the ABC Listen app.